Hi everyone. In this video, we'll be talking about using research to develop a therapeutic alliance. So one primary purpose for research in psychology is linking empirically based findings to applied treatment interventions and strategies. There's lots of research that has consistently found a significant relationship between a therapeutic alliance or a strong therapy relationship with your client and therapeutic outcomes. Alliance has actually been found to be one of the most robust predictors of success in therapy. Because of this, we're going to be spending some time in this lecture discussing the research on the relationship between therapist attributes, characteristics, and strategies, and the building of the therapeutic alliance. We'll start with some techniques that have been found to significantly enhance the alliance during the initial phase of therapy, and then we'll move on to some specific strategies that you can utilize to help impact the alliance positively throughout the remainder of therapy. So first, we're going to discuss the therapeutic model of assessment, which describes three overarching principles that can support alliance building during the assessment period. Assessment is sometimes considered to be a dry and impersonal period, but in reality, it's your first and best opportunity to build relationship. Think about it. This person, your client, is telling you very personal information about them, and it requires trust and will inherently bring closeness if it's done with intentionality and compassion by the therapist. So the following principles can help a little bit with this. So first, develop and maintain an empathic connection. So you could say something like, we've covered a lot of ground today and I've asked a lot of questions, but is there something we haven't touched on that you think is vitally important to knowing you as a person? This shows that you are trying to get to know them, that you want to understand their experience, and that you are seeing them as the experts in their experience. You also want to work collaboratively with your clients to define individualized assessment goals. Exploring the client's perspective of their mental health issues and developing individualized treatment goals and tasks in an interactive rather than one-sided manner where you are coming and saying, well, here's what you need to do, here's how I'm going to fix you. And so, for example, you could say something like, what's most important to you right now? Or at the end of therapy, what would you most like to see differently or to be different in your life or to have changed? And then you can use this information to develop your treatment goals and have more buy-in with your client. Finally, you want to share and explore assessment results. Many times when assessments are completed, that information is kept by the therapist and isn't really shared with the client. And so it may leave the client wondering like, well, why did you ask me all that information? Like what came out of it, right? And so we can provide a psychoeducation on symptoms and the treatment process. We can offer information that's specific to the client based on what we learned from them. We can review and explore the meaning of assessment results, like why did the client do this measure of depression and what does it mean? What does it tell you as the therapist? We can provide the client with new understanding and insight based off of our assessment and what we've gotten from it. And we can collaboratively develop treatment goals and tasks based upon what is learned in the assessment period. Next, we're going to talk about some specific strategies that can be used to improve alliances. So these are things to keep in mind and incorporate into each session, and they've been identified in the research as associated with positive therapeutic alliances. These are discussed in a lot more detail, and there are some additional ones added in the Okamoto and colleagues article that you were assigned to read this week. So if you haven't looked at that one, I definitely recommend doing that. Maybe doing it first or right after you watch this. Okay, so first, we want to structure and maintain a clear treatment frame. This involves conducting longer, more involved, and depth-oriented interviews. During this period, we want to adopt a collaborative stance, which I've already mentioned before. This is an especially important one, though. The client should feel like they're an active participant in therapy, not a passive recipient. You can support this by offering the client choices and what to discuss, how to address things, by seeking their feedback, and by collaborating on goals and intervention decisions. You also want to speak with emotional and cognitive content and use clear, concrete, and experience-near language. Don't use a bunch of jargon that the client's not going to understand. It's also helpful to use open-ended and reflective queries to get the client talking and allow them to lead the session rather than using yes or no questions or making assumptions about what you think the client is going to say. You also want to use Socratic questioning or dialogue. This involves asking discovery-oriented questions to facilitate cognitive change. For example, what would the benefits be of talking about this issue with your partner? And then seeing what happens and what the client says. And then returning and saying, okay, what might the negatives or the disadvantages be, right? And this allows the client to do their own thinking and their own insight building and to feel more invested and more ownership over the therapeutic process and the insights they come up with because they came up with it as opposed to you telling them, right? So it's going to stick a little bit better. You also want to maintain session focus, and this has to do with maintaining a flow of the session. This might mean redirecting your client when they go on unproductive tangents, pacing discussion of certain topics so that clients don't rush through things or dwell on them too long, and so on. In order to establish this, it's helpful to have a structure to your sessions wherein the client can predict the order of things. For example, you might start with a check-in and a functional assessment, then follow up with a discussion of homework and how that went and any barriers to completing their homework, then review large or significant issues in the moment, and so on. This way, the client gets used to what they're going to be discussing with you and they can be prepared for that, right? Another important one, and this is a bit of a more difficult one, is to address relationship ruptures. So ruptures can damage the therapeutic relationship if they're not addressed directly. And these happen when perhaps the client feels something negatively toward you or feels that you feel negatively toward them, right? As soon as you, as the therapist, become aware of a maladaptive interpersonal pattern, which we could call a rupture, you should address it directly. You can do this by asking the client to discuss what's going on in the session, or you can share your own experience of what is happening between you in the session. For example, saying something like, I'm feeling really distant from you in the session, right? Or you could say to the client, it seems like you withdrew a little bit. Do you want to tell me a little about what that's about? Something like that. It's important to note that this isn't done in a blaming or accusatory tone, like, oh, you just gave me attitude. What's up with that? Like, that's not helpful. Instead, you're framing these patterns and these interactions as efforts to cope, and you're also acknowledging your own contributions to the rupture, right? Maybe you said the wrong thing. In this way, you're modeling relationship repair and improving the therapeutic alliance. Okay. Ending sessions and managing sessions is the last one that we're going to talk about. So similar to maintaining session focus, you want to close your sessions in an intentional and predictable way that will improve your alliance building. There are 3 things you want to make sure to do when you're ending your session. 1, summarize your session and any insights that you came up with. This is going to make it easier for your client to remember what they got out of therapy with you, right? You also want to finalize the plan for between session interventions. Are they being assigned homework? Are you checking in on the phone? Are they given a task to complete, right? Whatever that is, remind them, connect it back to their session, and they're hopefully more incentivized to do it. And then you want to seek the client's feedback about the session and planned interventions. How do they feel about the session? How do they feel about their homework? How do they feel about where you're going? This is really important. Doing this is going to help the client to feel more agency or control over the session. It's going to solidify the insights that they're developing, and it's going to link those insights into what you're going to be continuing to do in therapy. Okay, so that's it for this lecture. As I mentioned, your article for this week goes into this in much more depth. I just wanted to give you some of the highlights, and we'll talk more about this in our in-class activity this week. All right, so let me know if you have questions. Thank you for listening.